What's going on, guys? Tower number 9 here, and today I'm going to talk about how I was wrong about Chewie, and I think he actually can be very strong in this game's draft format. Let's get into it. So, brief history here. So, Chewbacca, walking carpet, 7 cost, or 7, 7 or more resources to deploy. A vigilance heroism leader, 2/9 with sentinel and grit, and on his leader side he can exhaust to play a unit that costs 3 or less from hand, paying its cost. Chewie really did seem to be disappointing to me based on some of the early looks people had at him. And when the game released, several people did draft tier lists and so on, and Chewie often occupied a pretty low point on those tier lists, sometimes considered among the worst leaders in the game. But I've had some experiences that have made me reevaluate that. So I was at a draft. I had a Han deck that I thought was pretty good. This was at a store up in San Francisco. I ended up going 2-1 in that draft, with my loss being to someone playing Chewie. And I was really surprised because I don't really think of Chewie as being very strong, but this guy's deck seemed like it had a pretty solid game plan, and he was able to beat me with it. It made me think, hey, maybe Chewie is better than I think. Maybe there's some merit to this leader. And so later on, I did a few drafts myself with Chewie, and I actually ended up going 3-0 or 4-0 in all of those drafts. So I believe I have drafted Chewie 3 times now, and each time I ended up going undefeated. So that's I'm not saying that means he's great. I might have just gotten lucky. I might have had favorable matchups or whatever. But I found that the decks that I could put together with him actually seemed like they were really good. So I just want to delve into that a bit and discuss how I think Chewie can actually be quite good in the draft format. So my draft tactics with Chewie, so the standard draft tactics apply. So I have the Baron system for draft prioritization. I have another video that goes into that in more detail, but I'll have a quick slide with an overview of it here. But upgrades are a lot better for Chewie than some other leaders, because if you put upgrades on Chewie the unit, you can end up in a situation where it's extremely difficult for the opponent to deal with him. I had one game where I got a Jedi lightsaber and an electro staff on Chewbacca, and my opponent was trying to take him out, got a bunch of damage onto him, but couldn't finish the deal. And I ended up hitting the enemy base for 18 in one attack to win the game. It was crazy. So, Chewbacca really scales heavily with upgrades, because not only do they work well with his high HP, but if they boost his HP further, they mean that he can get even more power thanks to grit. However, one of the risks when you're playing Chewie is what happens if the opponent closes the game before Chewie deploys. So you also want to be on the lookout for 3-drops that make good Sentinels with Chewie's ability, and for restore and larger Sentinel units that can maybe help you reach the late game. I also think that having a good balance of ground and space is unusually important, because when you're playing for kind of a later game plan, if you have only ground units and your opponent has an uncontested space lane to just push damage through, they're probably going to be able to get you, even if Chewie comes out to take over the ground arena. And one other note is that I've generally found that the command aspect pairs well with Chewie. You get some ramp cards, you get the cheap upgrade Academy training, which seems to be a low draft priority for a lot of people, but works really well for you, and some very strong command heroism units as well. So, getting into this in more detail, the Baron system for draft prioritization. This is a tactic that I discussed in more detail elsewhere. I'll have a link in the video description to my video on this. Baron is named after Baron Soontir Fel, but it is an acronym that stands for Bombs, Ambush, Removal, Opening, Nice to Haves. And the idea is that you want to draft cards in that order. So the highest priority is the bombs, then ambush, then non-ambush removal, then opening cards that you can play on that first turn, then nice to haves. So, Chewie has relevant cards in all these categories. So Jedi Luke, for instance, is a really sweet card to see for Chewie. That's probably the best bomb you can get. Redemption Medical Frigate is very solid for Chewie. There are some good ambush cards with things like Rogue Squadron Skirmisher. Even the humble basic Snowspeeder can be really good. If you're going yellow, I think that the Syndicate Lackeys are a great option. There are a bunch of removal options, and because you are playing Vigilance, you have access to some of the best removal in the game with cards like Takedown, Vanquish, Make an Opening can be really good against certain targets. And, opening just your early game, and then nice to haves are less important things that smooth the curve. So, maybe you've looked at your curve and you're like, oh yeah, I have like I have some nice opening cards, I have some nice end game cards, but my like 4 cost, 5 cost slot is weak, and in that case, that might be a thing to prioritize for your draft. So that's the brief overview of the Baron system, and there is a link in the video description below if you want to check out more on that. Going into some more Chewie-specific draft tactics, temporary Sentinels can be important. So Chewbacca's leader ability lets you play units of 3 or less cost as temporary Sentinels, and they can kind of be roadblocks for your opponent. Some units are extra good at doing this compared to others. So like Yoda is great because you can play him as a Sentinel. He has 4 HP. If they don't clear him out, he can start attacking for Restore, which is another thing you want. And if they do clear him out, when defeated, means that you get to draw a card. So you can also, in some situations, make your opponent draw if they're about to mill out or whatever, but generally you're going to use this on yourself. There is a less widely played card, Wilderness Fighter, that is a strong pick, and that one's extra good because it's a low priority for others. And you can also use this ability with the good old Fleet Lieutenant. So options in both ground and space can be relevant. You know, you're getting these temporary Sentinels out to block your opponent and allow you to prevent them from attacking your base to try to close the game early. And it is worth noting that once Chewie deploys, you don't actually have this. So it can sometimes be awkward if the space arena is open and you would like to be putting in some Sentinels, but because Chewie has deployed, you can't do that. So that's a little thing to watch out for when playing Chewie. Upgrades, great for Chewie. Academy training here is really solid. Upgrades allow you to tank even more damage from your opponents. Several of the upgrades also make him do more damage himself just by default, which can be useful if the opponent is trying to avoid attacking Chewie to prevent powering him up with grit. But an upgraded Chewie can be a huge problem, and if you have Chewie with even like 1 or 2 solid upgrades, I consider this kind of like I call it a built-in bomb. So like a lot of decks try to draft bomb units to like take over the late game, like try to get that Vader, try to get that Luke, but the odds of drafting something like that aren't really that high. And Chewbacca is kind of a built-in bomb because that 2/9 Sentinel and Grit, it can really take over the ground arena in the late game. The question is just how do you survive long enough to make use of it? And so going back to the temporary Sentinels, one cool thing is that there are some cards that are not good in other decks that become good as temporary Sentinels. This Wilderness Fighter that I have highlighted here, a 3-cost 2/4 with Shielded, for a lot of decks, this is a very mediocre, like very, okay, I guess type card. But for Chewie, if you throw this out there and it becomes a 2/4 Shielded with Sentinel, it can very easily stop even a large number of attacks. Like even later in the game, this is likely going to absorb at least 2 and maybe more attacks from the opponent and prevent them from doing that damage to your base. So this can be a solid option. And if you combine it with those upgrades that I discussed earlier, it can work really well. And I mentioned this earlier, but Fleet Lieutenant. So when you play Fleet Lieutenant, you can use Chewie's ability to play the Fleet Lieutenant, have it be a temporary Sentinel, and then make your attack at the same time. So in this way, often you can get some good value with this. Like let's say that your opponent plays like a 2/3 ground unit on turn 1, and you play an Alliance X-Wing, a 2/3 space unit. On turn 2, if they don't attack with their ground unit, you can use Chewie's ability with the Fleet Lieutenant, make it a Sentinel, attack with your X-Wing, giving it a buff to do some extra damage to their base, and now their unit has to attack into the Fleet Lieutenant and potentially be defeated if they don't have any buff or upgrade of their own. So you've also managed to slow them down in the ground arena, which can be really solid. Yeah, overall, Chewie's ability can be pretty annoying, and it's an important way to try to buy extra time, especially against more aggressive builds. Another thing that can help you with that is using Restore units. So Restored Arc 170 is a really solid option. For instance, you can play this on the first turn, and that Restore 1 can really add up if it isn't answered. I was talking earlier about good old Yoda. Yoda is a great option for Chewie, I think, not only for the Sentinel option, but also for his Restore 2, allowing you to prolong the game. Kanan Jarrus, his ability can have a similar effect to Restore, so on attack you may discard 1 card from the defending player's deck for each friendly Spectre unit, heal 1 damage from your base for each different aspect among the discarded cards. And it's important to note that it does not say each other friendly Spectre unit, so Kanan, because he is himself a Spectre, will always be milling at least 1 card if you use this ability. And if you have, maybe you have a copy of Ezra if you're playing blue-yellow, or maybe you're playing blue-red and you have Sabine, sometimes you can mill multiple cards and potentially do more healing. Having some of the bigger Sentinel units can also be helpful. The temporary Sentinels are nice, but maybe your opponent can get around them. Maybe they wait and attack on the next turn instead of just charging in there and trading units and so on. So having some bigger Sentinel units like Obi-Wan can also be an asset. And Obi-Wan's especially nice because when defeated, giving those 2 experience tokens to another friendly unit is basically like an upgrade. So if you have Obi-Wan and then you bring out Chewie, lose Obi-Wan, and give Chewie +2/+2, that can put your opponent in a dangerous spot where just when they've cleared one big Sentinel, now another one has showed up. So these restore things can help to slow down the early game. The larger Sentinels can help give you some more time in sort of the mid game before you get to the end game state where you're trying to bring out Chewie and do some major damage. It can also be important to have some options in space. So the Corellian Freighter, which is a 5-cost generic aspectless 5/5 with Sentinel, or I'm sorry, 4/4 with Sentinel in space. Not a great card, but it might be what you need in order to slow down the space arena and get yourself some more time. So those are some quick thoughts on drafting Chewie, and I'm curious, how has drafting Chewie been for you? Or have you also found that he can be a lot stronger than some people thought at first glance? Because to me, I actually am now kind of excited if I end up drafting Chewie, whereas when the game started, and even I think in some of my early opening videos, I was talking about how I'd prioritize other leaders above him. After having played some drafts and thought about the situation some more, my opinions really changed. So yeah, curious if you guys think the same. That's going to about do it for this one, guys. Thanks to y'all for watching, and we will be back later with some more Star Wars Unlimited content. I will catch you guys later.